Take that filthy rag off in my courtroom now. Judge Walter Pruitt hurled the case file across his bench papers, scattering like startled birds over the polished mahogany. He jabbed his gavel toward the tall black man standing quietly before him. I don't care what you think you are. You walk into my court looking like that a big black man in some scorched military costume, and you expect me to take you seriously. This is a court of law, not a back alley surplus store. The man said nothing. Pruitt leaned forward, his lip curling, and pointed the gavel at the worn patch on the man's shoulder. What is that, a Halloween costume you people love playing dress up? Don't you slap on a jacket and suddenly you're a hero? Pathetic. A few spectators shifted uncomfortable. Pruitt didn't care. He smiled the thin, cruel smile of a man who had never once been told no in this room. Let me make it simple for you. Men like you don't get to raise children. You can barely dress yourself. Now take it off, or I'll have you dragged out of here in cuffs, and you'll never see that boy again. The man did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there in a worn olive field jacket, scarred hands folded, while an 8-year-old boy in the second row began to cry. What Judge Pruitt didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the faded patch on that man's shoulder carried a single call sign. And in less than 10 minutes, a Navy admiral walking past those doors would hear it freeze mid-step and bring the entire courtroom to its knees. Stay with me until the very end of this one, because the moment that jacket comes off, nobody in that room will ever breathe the same way again. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And if you believe a person's worth is never measured by the clothes on their back or the color of their skin, subscribe and walk this story with me. The morning the world tried to take Eli away, Marcus Webb woke at 4:47 a.m., the way he always did before the alarm, before the light. He lay still for a moment in the cramped 2-bedroom apartment on Hawthorne Street, listening to the small sounds of a life he had built out of nothing. The hum of the old refrigerator, the rattle of the heater, the soft breathing of a child down the hall. Then he rose, washed his face in cold water, and went to make breakfast. Marcus was 38 years old. He stood 6'2" broad through the shoulders, with a quiet, careful way of moving, as if the world were made of glass he had already broken once. He cracked 4 eggs into a pan and toasted bread the way Eli liked it, barely browned, cut into triangles. By the time the boy padded into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, the plate was waiting. "Morning, Uncle Marcus," Eli mumbled. "Morning, little man. Eat. Big day." Eli Hartley was 8 years old, with sandy hair and his father's stubborn cowlick. He was not Marcus's son by blood. He was something more complicated, and in Marcus's heart, something even greater. He was a promise. For the past 2 years, Marcus had worked the night shift as a custodian at Lincoln Middle School, mopping floors and fixing boilers from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, then coming home to get Eli ready for school. On weekends, he turned wrenches at a friend's garage on Vine Street for an extra $40 a day. It was not a glamorous life. Nobody wrote stories about a man who buffed gymnasium floors in the dark. But Marcus had never wanted glamour. He had wanted only this to keep his word. He tied his tie 3 times that morning before it sat right, his thick, scarred fingers fumbling with the knot. He owned exactly 1 suit, gray, slightly too tight in the shoulders, bought second-hand for the occasion. And over it, before they left, he pulled on the one thing he never went into a hard day without: a worn olive field jacket, scorched black along one shoulder, the cuffs frayed, a faded Velcro patch sewn at the shoulder, bearing a single-stitched call sign, Ghost 6. Eli looked at it. "You're wearing the jacket." "Yeah. Mom said it was your lucky one." Marcus's jaw tightened. Something like that. He never spoke about where the jacket had been. He never spoke about the burns it hid, or the man whose blood had once soaked into its lining, or the night it had been the only thing standing between him and the end of everything. To Eli, it was just Uncle Marcus's jacket. To Marcus, it was armor. He needed armor today, because today the state of California would decide whether Eli stayed with him or was handed to two strangers with a great deal of money and a great deal of contempt. Eli's father, Daniel Hartley, had been Marcus's brother in every way that mattered. They had served together, bled together. Danny had been killed overseas. Eli's mother, Danny's wife, had died of a stroke 14 months later, leaving the boy alone in the world, with one name written in his father's will under legal guardian Marcus Webb. It should have been simple. It was not. Because Eli's maternal grandparents, Richard and Catherine Ashford, lived in a 6,000-square-foot house in La Jolla and had decided suddenly that they wanted their grandson. They had not visited in 2 years. They had not called on his birthday. They had cut their own daughter off when she married Danny, a man they considered beneath them. But now, with a small fortune in survivor benefits attached to the boy, they had hired the most expensive family attorney in the county and filed for custody. Their petition described Marcus in careful, poisonous language, a single male veteran with a documented history of combat trauma, an unstable home environment, a low-wage night worker unfit to provide stability for a young child. They never wrote the word that sat underneath all of it. They didn't have to. Marcus had read the petition 4 times. Each time his hands had gone cold. "Uncle Marcus," Eli's voice was small. "Are they going to make me leave?" Marcus knelt down so they were eye to eye. He put one heavy, scarred hand on the boy's shoulder. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "I made your dad a promise, and I have never broken a promise in my whole life. You understand me? Whatever happens in there today, whatever anybody says about me, you keep your chin up. We Hartleys and Webbs, we don't fold." Eli nodded, his lip trembling. Okay. Marcus stood, took a breath, and squared his shoulders the way he used to before a door breach. "Let's go." They drove downtown in his old pickup, the heater wheezing, neither of them saying much. The San Diego County Family Court loomed gray and enormous against the morning sky. Marcus parked, fed the meter 4 quarters, and took Eli's small hand in his enormous one. At the security checkpoint, the guard looked Marcus up and down the second-hand suit, the scorched jacket, the dark skin, the size of him, and ran the wand over him twice slowly, while the well-dressed people behind him waited and stared. Marcus said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of dignity. Then he led Eli down the long marble hallway toward the heavy doors of Courtroom 3B, where a man in a black robe was already waiting to decide that a person like Marcus Webb didn't deserve to keep the only family he had left. He had no idea what was about to happen inside. Courtroom 3B was cold and bright and smelled of floor wax and old paper. Marcus settled Eli into a seat in the second row behind the small wooden gate and squeezed his shoulder once before taking his place at the respondents' table. Across the aisle, the Ashfords had already arrived. Richard Ashford was a lean man in his late 60s in a navy suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. Catherine Ashford sat beside him in pearls and a cream blazer. Her chin lifted, her gaze sliding over Marcus and Eli, the way one looks at a stain on an expensive rug. Between them and slightly ahead sat their attorney, and the attorney was the real opponent in the room. His name was Preston Vance. He was 50, silver-haired, impeccably tailored, with the easy, predatory calm of a man who had won far more cases than he had lost. He arranged 3 matching legal folders in a precise row, uncapped a fountain pen, and smiled at nothing. At Marcus's table sat Rachel Green. She was 29, a legal aid attorney carrying a caseload of 41 clients, and she had met Marcus exactly twice. Her files were stuffed into a single battered accordion folder, one corner held together with a binder clip. She gave Marcus a tight, nervous smile and whispered, "Just let me do the talking. Whatever they say, don't react." "All rise." Judge Walter Pruitt entered like weather. He was a heavy-set man with iron-gray hair and small, sharp eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. Pruitt had sat on the family bench for 19 years, and he was known throughout the courthouse for two things: the immaculate order of his courtroom and his belief that a man's character could be read in the press of his shirt. A loose tie was an insult. A wrinkled jacket was a moral failing. He took his seat, surveyed the room, and his eyes snagged just for a moment on Marcus. On the dark skin, on the second-hand suit, on the scorched olive jacket. Something flickered across his face. It was not curiosity, it was distaste. "We are here," Pruitt began, "in the matter of the guardianship of the minor child Elijah Hartley. Mr. Vance, you represent the petitioners. Proceed." Vance rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor." His voice was warm, reasonable, the voice of a man explaining something obvious to a friend. "This is at its heart a simple case, a simple question: where will this child thrive?" He turned almost regretfully toward Marcus. "My clients are devastated by the loss of their daughter. They want nothing more than to give their only grandson the life he deserves, a stable home in La Jolla, the finest private schooling, every advantage." He paused. "We do not dispute that Mr. Webb cares for the boy. But caring is not the same as capacity, Your Honor." He opened a folder. "Mr. Webb is a single man. He works the overnight shift as a janitor, leaving a child of 8 by necessity in irregular care arrangements. His income last year was $31,000, and he is a combat veteran with a documented service-related trauma history." Vance let the words hang. "We are not here to disparage his service. We are here to ask whether a man in his circumstances, his condition, his environment is truly equipped to raise a vulnerable child." It was masterful. Every sentence was a blade wrapped in velvet. He never said dangerous. He never said unstable. He simply painted a picture and let the room fill in the rest. Rachel Green rose to respond, and Marcus felt the gap between the two attorneys open like a canyon. "Your Honor," she said, her voice slightly too fast, "Mr. Webb was named as legal guardian in the father's will. He has cared for Eli without incident for 2 years. The child is healthy, enrolled, doing well in school." "Doing well by what measure?" Vance murmured, not even standing. "And the petitioners," Rachel pressed on, flushing, "have had no contact with the child for over 2 years until counsel." Pruitt lifted a hand, and Rachel stopped. The judge was not looking at her. He was looking still at Marcus. "Let me ask the respondent something directly." His tone was clipped. "Mr. Webb, you're a janitor." Marcus rose. "I'm a building maintenance technician at Lincoln Middle School, Your Honor. Night shift." "A janitor," Pruitt repeated flatly, as if correcting him. "And you propose to raise this boy on $31,000 a year, working through the night in a 2-bedroom apartment." He didn't phrase it as a question. He let his eyes travel down Marcus again, slow and deliberate, cataloging the suit the size of him, the jacket. "And you came into my courtroom dressed like that?" The room went quiet. Rachel started to speak. "Your Honor, with respect, his attire isn't—" "I'll decide what's relevant in my courtroom, counsel." Pruitt's voice had gone hard. He leaned forward, his small eyes fixing on the scorched shoulder of Marcus's jacket, on the frayed cuffs on the faded patch stitched at the shoulder. His lip curled. "What?" he said slowly. "Is that thing you're wearing?" Marcus's hands folded in front of him, tightened almost imperceptibly. Behind the gate, Eli had gone very still. It's a jacket, Your Honor, Marcus said quietly. I can see it's a jacket, Pruitt snapped. I want to know why you thought it was appropriate to wear filthy military surplus into a court that will decide the future of a child. And Marcus, who had faced things this man could not imagine, simply looked back at him and said nothing, because he knew that the next few minutes were going to decide everything, and he did not yet know how he was going to survive them. Judge Pruitt rose halfway out of his chair. I asked you a question, Mr. Webb. That jacket, take it off. The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. For a moment, no one moved. Marcus stood very straight at the respondent's table. Your Honor, he said, his voice low and even. I'd ask the court's permission to keep it on. Permission denied. Pruitt's face was reddening now. This is a court of law, not a homeless shelter. We maintain standards of decorum here. You will remove that ragged, scorched piece of garbage from your shoulders, or you will be removed from this room. Do I make myself clear? Rachel Green was on her feet. Your Honor, my client's clothing has no bearing on his fitness as a guardian. This is... Sit down, counsel. Pruitt didn't even glance at her. His eyes were locked on Marcus, and there was something hungry in them now, the particular pleasure of a small man who has found someone he is permitted to humiliate. I have been on this bench for 19 years. I have seen every kind of person try to walk into my courtroom and disrespect it, but this... He gestured at Marcus, at all of him. A grown man playing soldier. Across the aisle, Preston Vance said nothing. He didn't have to. He simply turned a page in his folder, slow and unhurried, letting the judge do his work for him. Catherine Ashford's mouth curved into the faintest, most delicate smile. Pruitt leaned forward, and his gaze fixed on the faded patch at Marcus's shoulder, the stitched letters worn nearly to nothing. Ghost 6. And what is that? He sneered, pointing the gavel. Some little badge you sewed on yourself. What does it say, Ghost? A short, ugly laugh escaped him. What is this, a video game you think because you bought a costume and stitched a nickname on it that makes you a hero? That makes you fit to raise a child? It's not a costume, Your Honor, Marcus said quietly. It is exactly a costume, Pruitt shot back. Men like you love to play dress-up in things you didn't earn. You strut in here scaring this courtroom half to death with your size and your war surplus theater, and you expect me to hand you a vulnerable little boy? He shook his head in disgust. No, absolutely not. Take it off folded up, and maybe I'll pretend you walked in here like a civilized human being. The cruelty of it filled the room like cold water rising. A clerk near the bench dropped her eyes to her desk, unable to watch. One of the bailiffs near the wall shifted his weight, his jaw tight, plainly uncomfortable. But no one spoke. No one ever spoke in Walter Pruitt's courtroom. And then a small breaking voice cut through everything. He's not playing. Every head turned. Eli was standing in the second row, his small fists clenched, tears streaming down his red face. Uncle Marcus isn't playing dress-up. That's his real jacket. It's from when he was a soldier with my dad. Leave him alone. Eli, Marcus turned his voice, gentling instantly. Sit down, buddy. It's okay. Sit down. It's not, Oak, the boy sobbed. They're being mean to you. Pruitt's face twisted. Get that child under control or I'll have him removed from this courtroom. He cracked the gavel once hard. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is the environment you've raised him in. Outbursts. Disrespect. No discipline. He pointed at Marcus. You have 10 seconds, Mr. Webb. Remove that jacket, or I will hold you in contempt of court and have my bailiffs do it for you. And I assure you a contempt finding today will not help your custody case. Marcus looked back at the boy he had sworn to protect, at the small, terrified face wet with tears, and then at the man on the bench, who held both their futures in his soft, manicured hands. He understood the trap completely. If he refused, he would be in contempt, unstable, defiant, exactly the picture the Ashfords had painted. If he obeyed, if he stripped the jacket off here in front of all of them, the room would see what was underneath, the burns, the grafts, the ruined skin he had spent 2 years hiding from a world that only ever looked at his arms with horror or pity. They would gasp. They would stare. And Vance would find some way to use that, too. See, he's damaged, he's broken, no fit father. Either way, he lost. That was the design. "Your Honor," Marcus said, and something in his voice had changed. The deference was still there, but underneath it now ran a different current. Low, flat, steady, the voice of a man who had given orders under fire while the world came apart around him. "I will stand. I will answer every question you have. I will respect this court. But I am asking you, one time as a man, please do not make me take this jacket off in this room." Pruitt heard the steel in it, and it enraged him. "Are you refusing a direct order from this bench?" His voice rose to a shout. "Bailiff, if the respondent will not remove that garbage himself, help him." 2 bailiffs stepped away from the wall, hands settling on their belts, and began to move toward Marcus. "Don't," Marcus said. It was not loud. It was barely above a whisper, but it carried something that stopped both armed men dead in their tracks. A quiet, absolute authority that did not belong in a janitor's second-hand suit. And out in the marble hallway, beyond the heavy doors of Courtroom 3, B, a man in a dress-white naval uniform walking past with a cluster of federal attorneys came to a sudden frozen halt because through the door, amplified by the courtroom's microphone, he had just heard a single phrase he had not heard spoken aloud in 4 years. Ghost 6. "I gave you an order, bailiff," Pruitt barked. "Remove that jacket." The 2 bailiffs took another step. The nearer one, a younger man named Officer Reyes, reached out almost apologetically toward Marcus's shoulder. "Don't touch me," Marcus said. He did not shout. He did not move. But the words came out flat and cold and certain, carved from some deeper place, and Officer Reyes's hand stopped 6 inches from the jacket as if it had hit glass. The young bailiff glanced at his partner. Neither of them advanced again. There was something in the big man's stillness, not a threat, but a fact that made the air around him feel dangerous to enter. "What are you waiting for?" Pruitt snapped from the bench. "He's one man. Take it off him." "Sir," Reyes said carefully, not taking his eyes off Marcus. "He's complying. He's not resisting. He is defying a direct order of this court." Pruitt's face had gone a deep, mottled red. He slammed the gavel down so hard the sound cracked through the room. "I will not be disrespected by some—" He caught himself just barely and changed the word. "By a man who can't even dress himself properly. Do you understand the gall of this, walking in here frightening this courtroom, defying the bench in front of the very child whose future is at stake?" Behind the gate, Eli had gone silent now, a worse silence than crying. He had pressed himself small against the bench, his eyes huge, watching the 2 armed men stand over the only person in the world who had never let him down. A court advocate seated nearby leaned over and whispered to him, but the boy didn't seem to hear. He was staring at Marcus's back, at the scorched shoulder, at the faded patch. Marcus could feel the boy's eyes on him. It was the only thing in the room that mattered. "Your Honor." Rachel Green tried again, her voice shaking, but climbing. "You are ordering officers to physically strip clothing off my client in open court with no finding of any threat over the style of his jacket. This is going to be in the record. Every word of it. I would urge the court strongly to reconsider." For 1 second, something flickered in Pruitt's eyes. Caution. The instinct of a man who had survived 19 years on a bench by knowing exactly how far he could go. Then Preston Vance, still seated, said softly, "Your Honor, my clients are simply concerned for the emotional safety of the child in this volatile environment." And the flicker died. Pruitt seized the excuse like a railing. "Volatile," he repeated, nodding. "Yes, that's exactly the word." He pointed the gavel at Marcus. "This is volatility. This is what happens when you let a man like this, a man with his history, believe the rules don't apply to him." He leaned forward over the high bench, savoring it. "Let me tell you something, Mr. Webb. I have read about men like you. War does things to the mind. Maybe you were a soldier once, maybe you weren't. I frankly don't care. But the man standing in front of me right now is unstable, defiant, and entirely unfit to raise a child. And every second you keep that filthy thing on your shoulders, you prove my point for me." It was breathtakingly cruel, and it was working. Marcus could see it working. He could see Catherine Ashford's small, satisfied smile. He could see Vance's pen moving calmly, noting it all for the record respondent, disruptive respondent, non-compliant respondent, demonstrating poor emotional regulation in the presence of the minor. Every humiliation was being quietly converted into evidence against him. And the worst part, the part that sat like a stone in Marcus's chest, was that the jacket was the one thing he could not give them. Not because of pride, because of what was under it. For 2 years he had kept his arms covered around Eli, around the school, around the whole civilian world that flinched at scar tissue and didn't know how to look away. He wore long sleeves in July. He had taught himself to live inside that jacket. It was the wall between his ruin and other people's pity, and pity in this room would be just one more weapon in Vance's hands. So Marcus stood his ground in the only way he had left. He stayed silent. He stayed still. He let the man on the bench rage, and he did not give him the satisfaction of breaking. "Fine," Pruitt said at last, his voice dropping into something quieter and far more dangerous. "Have it your way. Mr. Webb, I am finding you in contempt of this court. Bailiff, take him into custody. We'll see how fit a guardian he looks like from a holding cell." He raised the gavel. "And the child will be released to the temporary care of the petitioners pending—" "No!" Eli screamed, scrambling up. "No, you can't, Uncle Marcus!" Marcus turned. "Eli, Eli, look at me!" The gavel started to come down, and the heavy oak doors at the back of Courtroom 3B burst open with a crash that froze every soul in the room. Standing in the doorway, framed in the gray hallway light, was a man none of them had ever seen. Tall, weathered, his spine straight as a flagpole, dressed in the dress-white uniform of the United States Navy. A constellation of ribbons covered his chest. Gold braid gleamed at his shoulders, and his face had gone the color of ash. His eyes were not on the judge. They were not on the Ashfords, or the bailiffs, or the lawyers. They were locked on the scorched olive jacket on the faded patch at the shoulder, and on the 2 stitched words he had just heard cried out through the door. His name was Rear Admiral James Calloway, and 10 minutes earlier he had been the most bored man in the building. He had come to the San Diego County Courthouse that morning, not for any family matter, but for a joint federal military task force, briefing 2 floors up a dry affair about jurisdiction and smuggling interdiction. 26 years in naval special warfare had earned him many things. Patience for bureaucratic meetings was not among them. He had stepped out early, flanked by 2 federal prosecutors and an aide intending to find coffee. Then, walking down the marble corridor, he had heard a voice rise behind a heavy oak door, a judge ranting about a jacket. And then, faint but unmistakable through the courtroom's microphone, a child's scream, and beneath it a phrase that stopped James Calloway's heart cold in his chest. Ghost 6. He froze mid-step. One of the prosecutors nearly walked into him. "Admiral," the man said, "is everything—" Calloway didn't answer. He couldn't. The blood had drained from his weathered face, and for a moment he was no longer standing in a courthouse hallway in San Diego. He was 4 years and 7,000 miles away. Ghost 6 was not a costume. It was not a nickname some pretender had stitched onto a jacket to feel important. Ghost 6 was a call sign, and Calloway had spent the worst night of his career listening to it crackle over a radio. 4 years ago, in the Sangin district of Helmand Province, a special operations element had been moving through a valley at dusk when the lead vehicle struck a buried IED. The blast had flipped the Humvee and turned it into a furnace. Before the dust had even settled, the ambush opened up from the high ground on 3 sides, a coordinated kill zone, dozens of fighters interlocking fire. Calloway had been in the Tactical Operations Center that night, the senior officer overseeing the mission from behind banks of monitors and radios, helpless as the situation unraveled in real time. He remembered the chaos on the net. He remembered the casualty reports stacking up. And he remembered one voice, one steady, impossible voice, cutting through all of it. Ghost 6. The element's medic. A man who, while the convoy burned and rounds cracked overhead, had run toward the destroyed vehicle. The after-action report, which Calloway had read so many times he could recite it, described what happened next, in the flat language of the military language that did nothing to capture the horror of it. Ghost 6 had pulled a wounded teammate from the burning Humvee with his bare hands, his own jacket catching fire as he dragged the man clear. He had hauled 4 casualties one at a time across 40 meters of open ground under direct fire into a shallow defilade behind a rock wall. And then, with the rest of the element pinned and the relief force still 40 minutes out, he had done the unthinkable. He had held that position alone, treating the wounded and returning fire for over 2 hours. His radio calls that night had become a kind of legend in the community. Calm. Clinical. Reporting triage status between bursts of his own weapon. 2 urgent surgical one, expectant one walking. Still in the fight. He had taken shrapnel across his back and around through his left forearm and kept working, kept calling, kept his men alive in the dark until the QRF finally fought its way in at 0214. 3 of those 4 men came home. The 4th, the one Ghost 6 had pulled burning from the Humvee, died in his arms before the relief force arrived. The official record stated that Ghost 6 had sustained catastrophic career-ending burns and gunshot wounds, that he had been quietly medically retired, and that his file had been sealed under the highest classification. Calloway had never met him. In 4 years, he had never once been able to put a face to the voice. The man behind that call sign had simply vanished into the protected silence the country reserved for the people who did its hardest, ugliest work, and were never allowed to be named. And now, on an ordinary Tuesday in a family courtroom in San Diego, James Calloway had just heard an 8-year-old boy scream that name. "Admiral," the prosecutor's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Sir, the briefing." "Stay here," Calloway said. He turned and walked toward the courtroom doors. His aide started after him. He raised a single hand, and the man stopped. The Admiral's stride lengthened. By the time he reached the heavy oak doors, he was not walking so much as bearing down on them like a warship clearing the harbor mouth. Behind those doors, he could hear it still, the judge's voice climbing toward something final. "Finding you in contempt of this court. Bailiff, take him into custody. We'll see how fit a guardian he looks like from a holding cell. And the child will be released to the temporary care of the petitioners pending." A child's scream. "No, you can't, Uncle Marcus. the wood of a gavel beginning its descent. Admiral James Calloway put both hands against the doors and shoved them open with a crash that echoed off every marble surface in the room. The gavel stopped in midair. Every face in Courtroom 3B turned toward the doorway at once. The two bailiffs went still. The judge sat frozen, mouth open. And the Admiral stood there in his dress whites ribbons blazing his ash-gray face, fixed not on any of them, but on the broad-shouldered man in the scorched olive jacket and the two faded words stitched at his shoulder. For the first time in 4 years, James Calloway was looking at the face that belonged to the voice. And his own voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper. Ghost 6. For a long moment, nobody in Courtroom 3B moved. Marcus Webb turned slowly toward the doors. When he saw the man standing there, the dress whites, the gold braid, the ribbons, something passed across his scarred face that no one in that room had seen before. Not fear. Recognition. And beneath it, a deep old grief. The two men looked at each other across the silent courtroom, and the rest of the world seemed to fall away. Judge Pruitt recovered first, because men like Pruitt always do. "Who in God's name do you think you are?" he sputtered. "Bursting into my courtroom. We are in the middle of proceedings, bailiff. Stand down!" Admiral Calloway did not shout it. He did not need to. The two words rolled through the room with the weight of 26 years of command, and both bailiffs straightened instinctively before they even knew why. Calloway began to walk forward down the center aisle, his polished shoes striking the floor in slow, deliberate beats. "I said, who are you?" Pruitt demanded, but the bluster had cracked. "Rear Admiral James Calloway, United States Navy, Naval Special Warfare Command." He said it without looking at the judge. His eyes had not left Marcus. "And I would advise you, Your Honor, to put that gavel down." Pruitt's hand, still raised, lowered slowly to the bench. Calloway stopped a few feet from Marcus. Up close, his composure was costing him visibly. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved over the scorched shoulder of the jacket, over the frayed cuffs, over the faded patch, and finally to the man's face, to the deep, haunted steadiness in his eyes. "Cancel the contempt order, Judge," Calloway said quietly, still not turning. Pruitt found a scrap of his indignation. "I will do no such thing. I don't care if you're the Chief of Naval Operations. This man has defied this court. He refuses to remove an inappropriate, disrespectful garment in the presence of a child, and he can't take it off, Your Honor." The voice came from the gate. It was small and broken and fierce. Eli stood there, tears running down his face, gripping the wooden rail with both hands. "Please don't make him. Please. You don't understand." Pruitt's lip curled. "And why is that young man? Because he's so attached to a dirty jacket." Marcus closed his eyes. For 2 years he had kept the wall up. For 2 years he had decided who got to see and who did not. But the boy was crying, and the Admiral was standing there, and the man on the bench was about to take Eli away over a piece of cloth, and Marcus understood, with the cold clarity he'd once known under fire, that there was only one way through. He opened his eyes. He looked at Eli. "It's okay, buddy," he said softly. "It's okay." And then, with steady, scarred fingers, Marcus Webb reached up and pulled down the zipper of the olive field jacket. The heavy fabric slid from his shoulders and dropped to the courtroom floor with a soft, final thud. A collective gasp tore through the room. Beneath the jacket, Marcus wore a short-sleeved shirt, and from his wrists to his shoulders, both arms and the side of his neck were a terrible, ruined landscape of scar tissue. Deep burns, shining and warped. Skin grafts in mismatched patches. Knotted ridges of tissue where shrapnel had been carved out. The damage was so severe, so total, that it was immediately, sickeningly clear He had come within a breath of losing both arms. Catherine Ashford pressed a hand to her mouth. One of the bailiffs looked away. Even Preston Vance had gone still, his pen at last forgotten on the table. And on the inside of Marcus's right forearm, scarred but still legible beneath the grafted skin, was a tattoo, a navy trident, a single name, and a date. The name read Hartley. Eli stared at his uncle's arms. He had never seen them. In 2 years, he had never once seen them. "Uncle Marcus," he whispered. Marcus didn't reach for the jacket. He stood there, exposed, his ruined arms bare under the harsh fluorescent light, and met the judge's eyes without flinching. "This is why," he said quietly. "I didn't want him to see. I didn't want any of you to see. Not because I'm ashamed of it." His voice did not waver. "Because it's mine, and I get to decide who I show it to. That's the one thing nobody could take from me over there. I figured I'd earned the right to keep it here." The silence in Courtroom 3B was absolute, the kind of silence that presses on the chest. Judge Pruitt's gavel slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the bench. All the color had drained from his arrogant face. Admiral James Calloway looked at the scars. He looked at the tattoo, at the name of the man, whose face he had also never been able to forget. And then he did something that made every person in that courtroom stop breathing. He came to attention, spine straight, heels together, and slowly, precisely, with the crisp, knife-edged motion of a man rendering the highest honor he had to give, the Admiral raised his right hand in a salute. "It is an honor," Calloway said, and his voice, the voice of a flag officer who had buried more men than he could count, broke on the words, "To finally meet you in person, Ghost 6. He held the salute. "3 of my men came home that night," the Admiral said. "Because of you. I listened to you keep them alive on the radio for 2 hours. I have wanted to shake your hand for 4 years, and I was never allowed to know your name." A tear traced down his weathered cheek. He did not move to wipe it. "Petty Officer Webb, the United States Navy owes you a debt it can never repay." And in the second row, an 8-year-old boy looked at the name tattooed on his uncle's ruined arm, his father's name, and began finally to understand. Admiral Calloway held the salute for 3 full seconds, an eternity in that frozen room, and then brought his hand down with the same crisp precision. He bent, lifted the fallen jacket from the floor with something close to reverence, and held it out to Marcus. Marcus took it. "Thank you, sir." He did not put it back on. Not yet. He simply held it, his ruined arms bare, and that somehow was its own kind of courage. Then the Admiral turned toward the bench, and the warmth went out of him, like a tide going out before a storm. "Your Honor," Calloway said, and his voice had dropped to something quiet and terrible. "Do you understand what you just did?" Pruitt's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "That filthy military rag you ordered stripped off this man's back in open court." The Admiral let each word land. "That is the only thing standing between a decorated American war hero and the staring, ignorant pity of a room full of people who have no idea, not the faintest idea, what he gave so that they could sit here in comfort and judge him." He took a step closer to the bench. "You called him a man playing dress-up. You called his service a costume. You mocked a call sign that 3 living men say their prayers to. In 19 years on that bench, Judge, I doubt you have ever been more wrong about anyone in your life." A pin drop would have sounded like a gunshot. Catherine Ashford had shrunk back in her seat. Preston Vance was staring at his folders as if they might offer an escape. Pruitt swallowed hard, his throat bobbing above his pressed white collar. The arrogance that had fueled him for 19 years had simply evaporated. "Admiral, I was not aware of this man's service record. I had no way of knowing." "You didn't need to know his record. Calloway snapped. You needed to treat a human being standing in front of you with basic dignity. That's all. And you couldn't manage it because you decided what he was the moment he walked through your doors. He didn't have to say the rest. It hung in the air. Because of how he looked. Because of his job. Because of the color of his skin. Pruitt's face had gone gray. The court apologizes for the misunderstanding. Don't apologize to me, Calloway said. I'm not the one you tried to put in a cell. The judge turned slowly to Marcus. For a long moment, he seemed unable to look at the scarred arms, the bare, ruined skin. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its thunder. Mr. Webb, Petty Officer Webb, this court offers you its sincere apology for my words, for my conduct. He hesitated, then forced the rest out. I was wrong. Marcus inclined his head once. He said nothing. He didn't have to, but the Admiral wasn't finished. And him, Calloway said, nodding toward the gate, toward the small boy still gripping the rail. You threatened to take that child away from the man who carried his father out of hell. You owe that boy an apology, too. Pruitt looked at Eli, at the tear-streaked face, at the fierce, frightened eyes, and something in the old judge seemed to crack. Young man, he said more gently than anyone in that room had ever heard him speak. I'm sorry. I was unkind to your uncle. I was wrong to be. Eli didn't answer. He was still staring at the tattoo on Marcus's forearm. Calloway turned back to the room, and now he spoke to all of them. Let me tell you what this man did, so it's on the record forever. He nodded toward Marcus. 4 years ago in Helmand Province, an element was ambushed and a vehicle was destroyed. The man you mocked today ran into the fire and pulled his teammate out with his own hands. Those hands you can see right there, what's left of them. He held a position alone for 2 hours under fire and kept his wounded brothers alive in the dark. His voice thickened. He could not save them all. One man died in his arms before help arrived. He paused. That man's name was Daniel Hartley. The name dropped into the room and detonated. Eli's head came up. Rachel Green's hand flew to her mouth. And Marcus closed his eyes for just a moment, the grief of 4 years passing across his face like a shadow. Hartley, Calloway repeated quietly, looking at the boy. Your father. And the man standing next to that jacket is the one who held him at the end, and who has spent every day since keeping the promise he made to a dying friend. He turned back to the bench. That is the man you nearly put in handcuffs today for the crime of wearing a jacket. Eli was crying again, but it was different now, a release, not a fear. You knew my dad, he whispered to Marcus. You were there. I was there, buddy, Marcus said, his voice rough. I was always going to be there. Slowly, finally, he pulled the jacket back over his shoulders. He did not zip it. He didn't have to anymore. The armor had done its work. The room had seen the truth, and the truth had changed the air itself. Rachel Green rose from her seat. Something had ignited in her. The lawyer who had walked in, outmatched, was gone. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and steady now, in light of everything this court has just heard, I'd ask permission to present evidence regarding the petitioner's true motive for seeking custody of this child. Across the aisle for the first time all morning, Preston Vance looked afraid. Permission granted, Pruitt said. There was no thunder left in him at all. Rachel Green opened the battered accordion folder she had carried in, clipped together, and pulled out a slim stack of documents. Her hands were no longer shaking. Your Honor, the petitioners have described themselves as devastated grandparents seeking to give Elijah Hartley a better life. I'd like to establish a few facts. She turned to face the Ashfords. Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, when did you last see your grandson before filing this petition? Richard Ashford shifted. It's a simple question, sir. When? Silence. I'll answer it, Rachel said. According to the records, the last time either of you had any contact with Eli was at his mother's funeral, 26 months ago. No birthday cards, no phone calls, no visits. 26 months. She let it sit. In fact, you cut off your own daughter when she married Daniel Hartley because you felt a Navy enlisted man was beneath your family. You didn't speak to her for the last 6 years of her life. Is that correct? Catherine Ashford's chin lifted defiantly. That is a private family matter. Then let me ask a less private one. Rachel laid a document on the table. Your Honor, when Daniel Hartley was killed in action, his son became the beneficiary of his service members' group life insurance and a survivor trust. The total currently held for Elijah's benefit is $427,000. In addition, the child receives dependency and indemnity, compensation of $1,612 per month. She looked up. The petition for custody was filed 11 days after the trust completed probate, and the funds became accessible to a legal guardian. A murmur ran through the gallery. Objection, Vance said, rising, but his velvet calm had cracked. Counsel is implying— I'm not implying anything, Mr. Vance. I'm stating dates. Rachel pulled out another page. Here is the probate completion notice dated the 3rd. Here is your client's custody petition dated the 14th. 11 days. She turned to Marcus. Now let's talk about who has actually been paying for this child. Marcus spoke for the first time in minutes, his voice level. I have. Have you ever touched the trust? The insurance money, the monthly compensation. No, ma'am, not $1. It's Eli's. It's for his future college, a house someday. Whatever he wants. He nodded at the folder. It's all there, the account statements, 2 years of them, untouched. Rachel handed the bank records to the bailiff, who carried them to the bench. Your Honor, Mr. Webb has supported Eli entirely on his own income, $31,000 a year, working nights, so he could be home in the mornings while $500,000 meant for the child sat untouched in his care. Now compare that, she said, turning, to 2 people who ignored this boy for over 2 years and filed for custody 11 days after his father's death. Benefits cleared probate. The courtroom had turned cold and electric. In the front row, a heavy-set man, Marcus, didn't recognize a financial advisor. It would later turn out who had come with the Ashfords was going pale. This is outrageous! Catherine Ashford burst out, half rising. We are his blood. That money should be managed by family who understand finance, not handed to some, to a janitor who— She caught herself. But it was too late. The words were out. The mask had slipped, and the whole room had seen the face beneath it. The silence that followed was deadly. There it is, Rachel said quietly. Pruitt was staring at the bank records in his hands, then at the dates, then at the Ashfords. The mottled red was climbing his neck again, but this time it was not aimed at Marcus. Mr. Vance, he said slowly, dangerously, is the court to understand that your clients filed an emergency custody petition and submitted sworn declarations describing Mr. Webb as financially unfit 11 days after a $400,000 trust became accessible, and that they did not disclose this trust to the court? Vance opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at his folders. His silence was its own confession. Those sworn declarations, Pruitt continued, his voice gathering grim force, stated under penalty of perjury that the petitioners had maintained a, quote, loving and consistent relationship with the child. We have just established that to be false. He set the records down hard. I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for review of possible perjury and attempted fraud against a minor's federal benefits. Richard Ashford shot to his feet. Now wait just a— Sit down, Mr. Ashford. The old courtroom voice was back, but it had found at last a target it deserved. You will sit down, and you and Mr. Vance will remain seated, Because you and I are going to have a very long conversation." Vance sank into his chair, his face ashen. Catherine Ashford had begun to cry, not for the boy, for herself. And Marcus Webb stood quietly in his scorched jacket, one hand resting on the rail beside the boy he had carried out of hell and into a life, and felt for the first time in 2 years the cold weight begin to lift off his chest. Judge Walter Pruitt took a long moment to collect himself. When he spoke, his voice had changed quieter, humbler, carrying the weight of a man who had been forced to see himself clearly and had not liked what he found. "This court has heard enough," he said. "The petition for custody filed by Richard and Catherine Ashford is denied. In light of the evidence presented, it is denied with prejudice." He looked at Marcus. "The will of the child's father is clear. The conduct of the proposed guardian is not only adequate, it is frankly beyond anything this court has seen in 19 years. Mr. Webb, full and permanent guardianship of Elijah Hartley is awarded to you. He stays where he belongs." Behind the gate, Eli let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and threw himself against the rail. Marcus reached over and pulled the boy into his arms, scarred hands cradling the small head, and for a moment the big man's shoulders shook. "It's okay," he whispered into Eli's hair. "We're okay now. We're okay." Pruitt's gavel came down gently this time. "And Petty Officer Webb." The judge hesitated, then stood, and in front of the entire courtroom, the man who had screamed at him to take off his jacket inclined his head in something close to a bow. "Thank you for your service. And I'm sorry. Truly." 20 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 3B opened, and Marcus walked out into the marble hallway with Eli's hand firmly in his. He was bone-tired. The phantom aches in his scarred arms were throbbing with that familiar dull fire. But he was walking out with the boy, and that was the only thing that had ever mattered. A hand settled on his shoulder. He turned to find Admiral Calloway, his escort, waiting respectfully a few paces back. "Ghost 6, Calloway said. "Just Marcus now, sir." He managed a tired smile. "Ghost 6 retired a long time ago." "No," the Admiral said. "He just changed battlefields." He glanced down at Eli, then back up. "The way you held that room together in there, analyzing the case, protecting your 6, you're still operating Webb. You just put down the rifle." He reached into the breast pocket of his dress whites and drew out a heavy matte black challenge coin, the gold crest of naval special warfare gleaming on its face. He pressed it into Marcus's scarred palm and closed the ruined fingers around it. "I run a combat trauma training facility up the coast. We desperately need a senior instructor who's actually been there. Name your price, and the job is yours. You'd never scrub another floor in your life." Marcus looked down at the coin, feeling the raised metal against the damaged nerves of his hand. For a moment, the ghosts of Helmond flickered behind his eyes. It would be good money, respect, a way back to the brotherhood. Then he looked down at Eli, at the boy watching him, with wide, trusting eyes, and the ghosts faded. "Thank you, Admiral," Marcus said, "genuinely. But I've got a more important post." He squeezed the boy's hand. "This one's got a parent-teacher conference Thursday, and a science fair I promised to help with, and he likes his toast cut into triangles. There's nobody else who can cover that shift." He smiled. "I made a promise to his dad. I'm not done keeping it." Calloway studied him for a long moment. Then slowly, the Admiral nodded, and something like understanding and respect settled over his weathered face. "Daniel Hartley," he said quietly, "was a lucky man to have you carry him, and his son is luckier still." He stepped back and came to attention one final time, rendering a slow, perfect salute. "Carry on, Petty Officer." Marcus returned it, the old motion still clean, despite the scars, and then the Admiral turned and walked back down the corridor, his white uniform receding into the gray light. Marcus knelt down in front of Eli. The boy looked at the scarred arms again, but this time without fear. "Those are from saving my dad," Eli said. It wasn't a question. "Some of them," Marcus said softly. Eli reached out and touched the worn olive jacket, the faded patch at the shoulder. "Ghost 6, he read slowly. "That was you. That was me." Marcus took the jacket off and with great care draped the heavy scorched fabric over the boy's small shoulders. It swallowed him whole. Eli looked up, startled. "One day," Marcus said, "when you're bigger, this'll fit you. And when it does, you'll understand what it means. It doesn't mean you're tough or scary or better than anybody. It means you stand by your people when it's hard. You carry the ones who can't walk. You keep your word even when the whole world says you don't have to." He set his scarred hand on the boy's head. "Your dad taught me that. Now I'm teaching you." Eli pulled the jacket tight around himself and wrapped his arms around Marcus's neck, burying his face there. And in the gray light of that courthouse hallway, a black veteran who had been called a fraud, a costume, a man unfit to raise a child, walked out into the world with his son, and not one person who saw them pass would ever have guessed at the war he had won twice, with the same 2 scarred hands. He had never needed the courtroom to tell him who he was. He had only needed to keep his promise. A man's worth was never in his uniform, his paycheck, or the color of his skin. It lived in the promises he kept when no one was watching and the people he refused to put down. The world judged Marcus by his jacket. It never knew the hero underneath until it was forced to look. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments, who is the quiet hero in your life that the world overlooks? Share this video to honor the veterans and the caretakers who carry others without ever asking for thanks, and subscribe to walk through more stories like this one with us every single week.